Welcome to another episode of Fair Folk at Work. You know, when you work at Fair, you have integrated two other parts of the world in your life, an Elizabethan village and the 16th century. My guest today has integrated two other worlds, the world of Hollywood and the world of the future. Here to discuss any connections between all of them is my good friend, John Copeland. John, how's it going?
It's going great, Dan. How are you?
It's going good. I'd like to start with a sort of traditional first question of Fair Folk at Work, which is who was the person who said there's this thing called Fair that you should go and check out? And what did he or she say to get you to come out to Fair?
Oh gosh, the first time that I heard about Southern Fare, I was probably a senior in high school. I was into theater then, and some of the folks that I was in classes with were going to go to the fair, and so I went along with them, and that was my first experience with the fair. Was about 1968, and it was amazing to see this recreation of an Elizabethan village with all the folks in costume and speaking in an Elizabethan dialect. And then the pageantry, the shows on the stages, besides the food and the music, were just wonderful. And so after that, became a regular attendee, I would say, of the fairs, all the way up until Once in Favor came together. In group that I was part of, we decided to try to do a show on one of the stages. And so we approached Peg and Ernie in about 19, I guess this was about 1977. And that was the transition point of being just a visitor to becoming a resident of Chipping, on the day.
Can I ask a
And
couple of questions before?
yeah, absolutely. Just jump in because I'll just kind of like run on and run on. So,
Running on is a fine thing, but I kind of, with my history background, I like who, what, when, and where. So,
mhm.
where did you go to high school?
Long Beach Wilson.
Okay. And do you remember the names of some of the theater people you were working with way back
Oh,
then?
yeah. Sue Kelb, Tony Frew, Mike Greenberg. A couple of names are escaping me, but those are pretty much the suspects that got me hooked.
Do you remember some of the early shows before you were an actor on stage that you looked around and said, I want to do that?
Yes, I mean, I had initially till I, kind of got into college. Even in high school, I was interested in Shakespeare, and I went to Chapman College, which is now Chapman University in the city of Orange. And what made me go there was they had a Shakespearean program. They did a summer Shakespeare in rep at Chapman where they did 3 shows across the summer, and I thought, oh my God, this is for me. This would be really cool. And of course, the fall that I went that I started at Chapman, they did away with the program for lack of funds. That left me with, okay, how do I satisfy this desire? But getting back to, initially going to the fair, well, it was, Sandy and Judy and Billy doing Commedia on the main stage. They absolutely captivated me. And the other shows, some of them were, really good and polished. Some of them are a little bit rough around the edges and all, but it was all kind of like spirit of being at the fair that it all kind of worked together. I also was Don Brown's Caravansary with the belly dancers from Levant. We're also, that whole scene, these exotic things that were very keeping with the period, which I was kind of unfamiliar with at the time, really registered. And I thought this is just this incredible mix of traditions, of backgrounds, of histories coming together. And I think that I did do quite a bit of Shakespeare in college and kind of left me with the desire for more.
When you auditioned for Shakespeare as a youth, what role typically would you opt for?
One of my favorite was Francis Flute the Bellows Mender in the Midsummer,
Hmm.
one of the mechanicals. Also, Trinculo in Taming of the Shrew. who
Mhm.
was the servant. And I'm trying to think of one of the servants that was out of the Tempest. It's one of the guys washed ashore that first encounters Caliban.
When you were that age, how did you see your theatrical career
I,
developing?
you know what? I thought that, I got a chance to do a lot of great characters. There were obviously folks older than me in college that were better suited to being one of the leads or the love interests
Hmm.
or anything like that. I was just there to have fun and have a part in the theater production. And along the way, while being a fan and attending the fair, and before deciding to, was putting together a little acting troupe that we did a show for the fair, I got involved with the Society for Creative Anachronism. And one of my other good buddies in college, David King, who was a member of Once in Favor, he and we were in the SCA for probably about 4 years. And, from probably about 1971 to 74, and it may have been 1970 to about 74. And that was attractive to us because that was as an organization that was an outgrowth from the fair. SCA started as a live chess game where instead of a rook takes knight or castle takes queen, you had to fight for the square. I actually saw that at Southern Fair where they had like two lifeguard chairs that were
Hmm.
elevated. And that's where, somebody paid, like I think you paid $20 or $10 to play chess. And then the chessboard was kind of painted out on the ground. And they had all of these folks. The chess pieces, they had all come out of Toad Hall in
Hmm.
Berkeley, which was a famous residence facility in Berkeley during the day. But it was like so cool. And David and I were both fledgling filmmakers.
Hmm.
And for my first film project, I actually took inspiration from Tolkien's Homecoming of Bjornoth, Bjornhelm's son, which was about the Battle of Malden in Wessex, where the Vikings outfoxed the English and won the day, killed the king, and his body taken to Ely Abbey for burial. And so the little film that I did was called The Freeman, and it was about the two servants that actually carried Bjornoth back. And it was like these guys were bonded slaves. And what was it like for them to experience their first day of freedom and what befell them? One of the requirements at the start of the thing is the end of the battle where the king gets killed. And so I needed a medieval army. I needed guys with swords and chainmail and shields and things like that. And I was trying to figure that out. And my professor thought this might be a little bit too challenging of a first project for you. And that's a good way to challenge me to go ahead and do something. But my friend David was in the Mythopoeic Society and he knew of SCA and how to get a hold of them. And so we actually called up a couple of guys and talked to them, told them about what we were doing. And then, on the day, I had 30 people show up with armor, and we actually staged a battle, and it turned out great. The film came together really nicely. I won a couple of student filmmaking festivals with it, and ultimately, it was instrumental in me getting my first job in Hollywood several years later.
Did you go to UCLA?
No, I went to Chapman.
Here's a random question.
Okay.
What did mom and dad think of you becoming an actor slash filmmaker slash running away to the fair kind of thing?
Well, ultimately, my folks were really supportive. When I went to college, my dad really wanted me to major in history. That was something that he was really passionate about. As a young person, he was not because during the Depression, he didn't have the opportunity to go to college. And my brother had gone to college before me. He went to become a lawyer. My dad thought, okay, why don't you study history? 2 weeks after I was at Chapman, I changed my major to theater, and my dad was a little upset about that, and his mom was a little. So when they came and saw that first fall production that I was in, which was Jean Anouilh's Tiger at the Gate, which is about the start of the Trojan War. After the show was over, and at Chapman, the dressing rooms in the theater were down in the basement below the stage. My dad came all the way back downstairs into the dressing room to tell me how much he enjoyed the show. That was to me was it's like, oh my God, he was accepting of what I wanted to do. And then years later, when we were doing the Reeves Tale at the fair, my dad and my stepmother, they came to at least two of the fairs to watch our show. And of course, they knew everybody that was in the cast with me on that because they, we were all good friends and shared stuff at each other's houses and everything like that. And so they were very, very supportive of that. And even before I had a taste of Hollywood before performing at the fair because I started working in the industry in 1974, and I was hired by a producer in England, Ewan Lloyd. He won a Palme d'Or for April in Portugal in about 1960 or 61. And the film that I worked on was called Paper Tiger with David Niven and Toshiro Mifune were the two stars. And when they had the premiere at Leicester Square in London, my dad came over to see that too because this was something else his kid had been involved with. So I had wonderful support from the family as well. And my brother and his wife, they came to the fair on a couple of occasions too to watch us. So it was like, I had everybody was out there kind of rooting for me. So
On Team John?
I guess so you would call it Team John.
I'm going to try. I'll ask again because I'm really enjoying this. But what did you like about, say, the acting style at fair that struck you as other than hanging out with friends and having a good time? But was there something being in this immersive environment that attracted you?
Oh, absolutely. It was how much folks got into the experience and kind of built on that experience. We were with Once in Favor. One of the things that we did besides create our own version of Chaucer's Reeves Tale that was not in ancient Middle English and hard for people to understand was our fair alter egos, the characters that we had to have when we were off stage. And we actually put together a second document. We had our play script, and then we had the story of Once in Favor of how all of us met and became a troupe of players. And we wrote that in the same style as Canterbury Tales in rhyming couplets. I think all of us, I think, Marilyn and Jimmy Boris, everybody would agree our fair alter egos were just as important to us of fitting in and playing on the streets as doing our show. And part of what we offered Peg and Ernie when we auditioned to them is we'll give you 4 shows on the stage every day, but we will also give you 4 hours of improv on
On
the
the
street.
street?
Yeah. And that would start up at the main gate in the morning before it opened when Will Wood's up there getting everybody revved up to come in. And there would usually be a run in with us and the sheriff and his men. Because we were an unsponsored troupe of players back then in Elizabethan times, you were liable for arrest and incarceration. So that was a thing that we played with David Springhorn and his sheriff's men on a daily basis. We had fun with them on that.
One of the things I learned that I really liked about what Phyllis did was that she collected a place where both the customers and the actors could play together with a common theme.
Absolutely. That's environmental theater, which
Right.
is, I mean, that's what it's all about. And that was really fun to participate in, including what Phyllis did and Ron earlier when they were still together. They created an atmosphere to give everybody a good footing in that. So, like the fair weekends leading up to the fair, where you were there and you had to practice speaking in the fair dialect and all so that you wouldn't drop out of character and go, oh yeah, for sure. And learning Peg was absolutely fantastic in some of these workshops on the fair weekends because she and Ernie or Dennis would give you situations where you could use these outlandish turns of a phrase that was really fun to participate in because all of the folks that were involved with me, we loved being able to do witty things. And that was things fly trippingly from the tongue. Those were also things that we look forward to being able to do on the weekend when fair was on.
One thing I really liked about doing street stuff at fair was that People walked by, you did something, you got a reaction, they walked away, and then there would be another group of people walking by.
Right. Well, your audience was constantly changing. So one of the things that we were notorious for doing was interrupting the Queen's procession. And we would
I'm sorry, go ahead.
well, what we would do is we would before fair opened, or actually even on the Friday evenings, we'd get with Peg and would say, we want to interrupt the Queen's procession. Here's what we're thinking about doing. And Peg would be in on it. None of the rest of the court or anybody else knew that there was going to be this totally out of left field thing interrupt the flow of their afternoon. So we would run up, prostrate ourselves across the footpath, going, "Oh, your Majesty, Your Majesty, a boon for us poor peasants." And we would beseech her to take pity on one of our uncles who was in Bethlehem Hospital, because she founded that, and he was in debtor's prison. And it was what was so funny to watch was, and Peg would make them put down the chair, and she'd step off and she'd come over and tell us to get up, listen to us very seriously, and then think about it for a couple of minutes, and then tell her secretary to write a release for our uncle. And everybody else in the procession was just like, some of the folks would get really pissed off at us because we interrupted the flow of things. And so all of a sudden, what they were thinking they were going to be able to do, they couldn't do because we had come in and interrupted things. But that kind of improv, all of us were into improv. We were also listeners of Fireside Theater, which was on KMET. Those guys did live shows when KMET was a pirate radio station. And so this crazy improv we brought into our street performance stuff, and those made it lively for us. We had a great time. I think it made for an interesting, refreshing experience for the patrons that were there watching as well. I mean, frustrating experience for the court, but that's okay.
One of the tensions we had in doing street theater was keeping it period enough to be like wearing the silly costumes, but making it modern enough so that the modern ear could pick up on what we were doing. Because as you pointed out, Middle English is not a laugh riot to a modern audience.
Oh, no.
How did you thread that needle between period Elizabethan and period 20th century?
Well, I think the tack that we took in doing our translation of the Reeves Tale was to put it more into Elizabethan, which is
Really?
and every performance we would start. Jim Boris, who was played, he and I were the two students in the Reeves Tale. He would step out and start the prologue in Middle English, and our narrator, who was Craig Fleming, Matthew Newt, would go and shake him and go, "Stop that. Don't you know they can't understand you?" He would take a moment and he would look out there and go, "Oh my God." And then he would go back and start again with the prologue in Elizabethan, because that's close enough to the language that we speak that most folks are going to follow the gist. And one of the other things that we love to do with our show, when the Miller releases two students' ass and he runs amok. Well, being in Orange County, we had friends that worked Disneyland and Disney on Parade. And we got one of the donkey musicians' heads from Pinocchio. Craig, he would put this on as when the Miller would let the ass loose. He'd do this, and he would run out into the audience with this donkey head on, and he'd find cute girls and sit down with them. And so James and John, the two students, would come out looking for their ass, and we'd finally spy him out there, and it's like, "Get back up here." And we'd and he'd go, "No, I want to stay with," and he'd be like in this girl's lap, hugging her or something like that. We'd have to go out, have to kind of chase him through the hay bales a little bit to get him back up on stage. So we also brought this stuff right out into the audience's lap. They weren't just watching a little stage show. They were getting dragged into it as well, because it came off the stage into the hay bales. For us, that was really fun. And it was important that, folks could understand what we were about, that they didn't miss any of the nuances. Yeah, and as a result, I mean, we had great crowds for every performance. We were always on Drury Creek stage. That was actually what we turned into our little camping abode as well. Because of this interplay that we would do with the audience, we had a lot of fans that would come and check us out. And also, folks from Hollywood. I mean, one day we're looking out there and Robin Williams is sitting on hay bale watching our show. And it was like, holy shit. And he came back and was chuckling and everything in the aftermath of the thing, and said very enjoyable, really fun. And that was
I
that.
that for well, I think is a wow moment in almost everybody's life.
Yeah, well, exactly. Exactly. I mean, there would we had a number of Hollywood folks that were kind of like once in favor fans. They would always be good for beer or wine or a bite to eat after we were done the show. For all of us, the fair was such a positive experience. We looked at it as a rite of spring. Also, this community that we got to be a part of and kind of get to know, in which oftentimes after everybody went home and we're still there, camping overnight, that was when some of the real fun stuff, and actually got kind of like ideas for interactions with these different groups. So let's say like the Celts, the Scottish, the Scottish folks and all, for something to do the following day with them improv in the street. And it was really a stimulating experience. Thought we had a lot of give and take with the other folks, that we all were part of a same community. And so that I think it made for a wonderful experience. And, back then, I mean, it was in the Guinness Book of World's Record as the world's largest environmental theater experience.
I did an interview with Judy Corey,
Mm-hmm.
and she talked about involving the audience at fair and how it was integral to what Phyllis was doing, that the patrons be invited to play. And Judy was very concerned with making sure that they could not fail, that if she brought them up on stage or
Oh,
played
yeah.
with them,
This is really interesting. And you know what? Judy is right on about that.
it was again the genius of Phyllis and et al. Was that they created an environment that both patrons and participants just kept coming back to.
This thing of involving the audience and in playtime
Right.
uh, on the streets was also something that was incorporated in those fair weekends, the 3 weekends leading up,
Workshop
to
weekends.
the
Yeah.
fair. Yeah, the workshop weekend. Because they wanted everybody that was gonna be a participant in the fair kind of have this understanding that the goal is to have everybody have fun. And if you are not nice or mean, or you don't let them succeed, that's not going to generate a positive experience. And that's one thing that the fair, I think, exceeded admirably at. I think it was a positive experience for years and years and years, which is why people kept coming back.
Which leads me to a different question. It sounds like you were both working in Hollywood and at fair at the same time.
I was.
Did you have to sort of mentally switch gears and not go into a Hollywood meeting and go, God, you good den with a big smile, or do a pratfall or something?
No, because the folks I worked with knew that they just kind of like recognized me as an eccentric person that you never quite knew what would come out of my mouth in meetings. Because even in working in Hollywood, if you're not having fun, you're doing something wrong. It should be, because this is what I wanted to work in that business more than anything else. I always had fun, even with the pressure. The funny thing was that usually on Friday, I had my car was all packed with, and my girlfriend at the time was also in our troupe. She worked the same production company that I did. Di and I would have all of our stuff packed in the back of my Carmen Ghia, and for everybody to see, and pennants coming out of the windows and stuff. And it's like, well, we're off to the fair now, and that created enough curiosity that a lot of the folks that I worked with also came to the fair to check it out. The fair and the concept of the fair was really engaging. It engaged people in a fun, positive way. One of our other close friends, who was not part of Once in Favor, but he was a street magician. And Mark, we all went to school together. And I think it was probably our senior year in college before any of us knew that Mark did any magic, because he was also very clumsy. He had some absolutely Homeric moments on stage where something would screw up on him. He wanted to make sure that he had his close-up magic craft down to where there were no mistakes like that. And my God, he did some absolutely brilliant things at the fair. And one of the really cool things was that all of the magic that he did was stuff that could have been done in Elizabethan times. He did not do the linking Chinese ring trick that so many magicians at the fair do, which was a trick that wasn't developed until 1930. So Mark did stuff with ropes, with scarves, sleight of hands, and he did, and I still don't know how he would do this, but a lot of times he did this stuff right as the fair opened. It would kind of get them set for the day. But he had a thing of doing scarves and tying them together and then giving them to some girl to hold and then taking them back and then putting them, doing something else with them. And when he took them back from them the second time, he would be pulling out the scarves through his hand, and out would come the girl's bra.
Oh, good Lord.
And it was just like, you'd watch him do this and go, okay, how did you do that? Because you're standing right there. I mean, we didn't. And Mark, do you realize that probably some boyfriend is going to kill you if you keep doing this? But I mean, these were just like these outrageous sleight of hands things, and he went on to do a lot of stuff at Magic Castle. And there used to be a magic place down on in Newport Beach called Magic Island, and he was just absolutely brilliant at that stuff. And the amount of money that he would make on tips was just almost criminal, because I mean he made more than all the rest of us put together with that. But he
I'm
was
sorry, what's Mark's last name?
his name was Hendrickson,
Mark Hendrickson.
and his fair persona was not the magician, KNOT. And his stuff with ropes and knots and everything was absolutely another visual brilliancy that he had. And with many of these things, one of the things that he had was he had a fake finger that he could put silks in. So he actually had 5 fingers and a thumb on his left hand that allowed him to feed things to the right hand. That was part of his technique, but I didn't find that out until actually years after we weren't doing the fair anymore.
One of the things I learned at fair, it's very big and it's very broad and it's very loud. So you need props. You need big, funny props that can be seen as you're walking on the road.
Well, you need that, and you also needed to project. Now, I'll share something with you that when, the start of every morning, when we got ready to kind of start the day, was a pint goblet of wine, because one of the things that we needed to prepare for was to be larger than life. And so it's not so much, it wasn't getting hammered, but it was getting, some of those inhibitions taken away. So I have my goblet, I would fill that up, start walking towards the front of the fair, and there was a place that made bread. And so they were cutting off chunks of bread with chunks of cheese on it. So I would get one of those and, wander up and, see what was happening at the start of fair. But we worked ourselves up to be larger than life so that we would be expansive. And on the street, it would help gather a crowd with large gestures and something like that. If you were on a stage, like on Drury Creek, that kind of stuff would draw people down, into the hay bales. And props that we had was we had the donkey head. We also had our sacks of grain and our long burlap things that we actually used as to whack each floor with. So those were, big and exaggerated, things as well. And then Marilyn Letchworth, who was Marilyn Prince at that time, she was so diminutive that we could actually pick her up and toss her out of the way on stage. The other thing that started happening was when you interviewed Jim, did he tell you down at Southern Fair he was often a pilgrim?
Yes.
He would come around with his big Bible and his dour expression, his all dressed in black, harangue us from the back of the hay bales. And so we would have to stop and go deal with him a little bit. And then we'd come back and start the show up again. And Jim was so much fun to play with on the streets that it became our duty to unravel him as this dour conservative religious guy and get him drunk by the end of the day. So he was doing a transformation in that role, just sort of like the transformation that he does when he plays Scrooge now at the Dickens Fair. So, but it's those were the fun things that just kind of happened on the spur of the moment at the fair. The fair kind of was this whole thing going on, and it had the ability to generate opportunities to play and to interact not only with your fellow fair folk, but get the patrons involved as well.
Have you ever used sort of that fair confidence bravado in your non-fair life?
Oh yeah, there's two things that the fair really instilled in me. One is never take myself too seriously. You have to be able to laugh at yourself and your foibles, even as everybody else is laughing at you too. So, but the other is just not be afraid to go for it. And for me, in my career in Hollywood, it was like, okay, I haven't done this before. That doesn't mean that I can't do it. And it gave me confidence in meetings with executives, network development people, with studio folks and the oversaw budgets and things like that. It gave me the confidence to not be intimidated by them because they were maybe a vice president or something like that. It's like, hey, they put on their shoe one at a time, just like me. And you know what? I did all of this crazy stuff out in front of people, and I didn't make me run away and hide afterwards.
The other thing that I learned at fair in front of audiences was that they by and large want you to do well. They have come out there to be entertained. And if you make a halfway decent effort to entertain them, they will reward you. Is that valid from your perspective of a fair audience?
Yeah, I think that the folks want to see the fun, the laughs. They want to see the bad guy get his comeuppance and good gals to succeed. And it's all very basic in a lot of the kinds of shows that are done at the fair, whether it's commedia, whether it's Chaucer like us, or a bit of Shakespeare or something like that. I mean, I love when the Reduced Shakespeare Company performed at fair. I mean, it was just like, oh my God, these guys, we thought we did things really well and trippingly off the tongue and didn't, stumble over words or anything like that. And I mean, we learned so much from watching, their performances and were engaged by it. It was very, very fun. But I agree with you that audience is there. They're rooting for you. They're rooting for you to not have a tragedy on stage.
Well, let me ask my hypothetical to you. Say you have a niece, we'll call her Chloe. She's 15, and at the Thanksgiving table, she has announced that she wants to do fair. And she says, Uncle John has done fair. And all eyes turn to you, and you say,
And I would say, it's a great experience for young folk. And Dan, I know you, just like me, know a lot of the second and third generation that came up through the fair and were none the worse for wear for it. And I would say, this is a great experience because how often do you get to take part in a kind of an environmental theater where everybody is a cast member, everybody's part of your troupe of players, as it were, and the things that you will learn are not maybe, historical things or anything like that, but they're cultural things and they're how to interact and they're how you will also start to, because there is enough history, I mean, after all, it was Living History Center, and you'll understand why we had maypoles, why other different aspects of life are showcased through a period lens there, but there's still valuable things to learn about life and growing up in experience. And I would support any young woman or guy in my family that wanted to go do the fair and say, what you probably want to get in, you want to get in on one of the guilds first. And then you can kind of, if this really does float your boat, it gives you a great opportunity to look at your fair experience in, as years go on. Maybe you want to be one of the washerwomen. Maybe you want to get into a stage play. Maybe you want to be part of Don Brown's. One of the really funny things is that I'm actually the historian for the Santa Ynez Historical Society and Parks Janeway Carriage House here in Santa Ynez. And one of our teaching curators, Teresa Riley, she used to be a dancer at Don Brown's.
Good Lord.
And we both kind of recognized each other when she first came to the museum. And it was like, holy shit, it's been 30 years or so since we had seen each other. But it was, right away, there's this bond between you, this shared experience that puts a good foundation for, working relationship or whatever. The fair was a way to continue to do also a theatrical experience, theater. It also, for me, because I stayed with it up until I got too busy with my career to be able to invest much time in the fair. I mean, certainly would go and play with Jim and Marilyn for a weekend or something like that. But it gave me, again, a good perspective of when I'm on a production, what an actor goes through to be in front of the camera, and gave me a good, for asking them to do a certain kind of a performance, you kind of know how to, what they may be going through, trying to find that hook to put that performance on. And I think it gave me a good basis for dealing with telling stories and working with people and directing people.
Was there something about doing the environmental theater for the Renaissance that bleeds over into, say, creating future worlds in film?
Well, I think so. I mean, one of the things in my entertainment career, I did a lot of westerns, and making the transition to doing science fiction, I moved from one frontier to a different frontier. It's still the frontier. And from the aspect of taking, the fair, yes, it gave me, in terms of, being a producer on a series, this environmental theater experience had all of the textures, the backgrounds, the kind of the clothes, and so you look for how that all integrated into a whole experience. And I think, trying to find that integration that really make things come to life in front of the camera. The fair was a great experience for giving me clues about how to make that happen. In my career in Hollywood, a lot of the folks that I worked with on the art department side, the makeup side, the wardrobe side, were all theater people. And they have an aesthetic that you don't often find with folks that never did have a theater experience. I mean, kind of the way that I can sort of use as example is that the production designer would design a set, and let's say it's one of our, on Babylon 5, maybe it's one of the ambassador's quarters. He collaborates with the wardrobe designer on the colors and textures that she is using in their wardrobe, and those also echo into the environment of the room so that it all feels whole. Those are the things that around your office, or your place of work, the things that you populate it with are what make it all have this texture and become real. They're not just like antiseptic. And that's, I think, one of the things that made, in the case of Babylon 5, made it so successful, because it felt like these things were real. One of the things, though, that the fair did incredibly well and was an impact on me was the fact that it felt real. It felt like a real community with the dust. When we would start at the end of April, the hills would still be
Right.
green, and it felt like a real place. Also, the attention to detail that the fair had with those of us that participated in the fair, and they would say, no, you can't use that material because there was no corduroy in the late 1500s. There were no zippers. You had to have buttons or laces in these period shows that I did, these westerns and all, it was not any more difficult to be historically accurate than to just make it up
Hmm.
and not have it be historically accurate. That was something that was a good lesson that I learned and took away from from the fair.
You might as well do it
Do it
right.
if
I
you're going
mean,
to do it right.
I was talking with Lois DeArmond a few interviews ago, and she's a costumer at fair.
Mhm.
And she also has worked in Westerns and loves working Westerns exactly for that same reason. You're creating a different world.
With a western, it's like the fair. Her reaction to is right on. You have to recreate the whole thing because we don't have these clabbered towns anymore. We don't have these, kind of one street towns. We also where everything moves by horse. You have to bring all of those elements together to make it feel real on screen. And so it's kind of an extension of what the fair experience was or putting together the fair every year from the folks that were put up the stages and all of that. They had to recreate chipping under Oakwood and this feel of community because it doesn't exist. And that's the way it is with westerns. And so everybody, you've got all these wagons, you've got these buggies, you've got differences in wardrobe styles. Even though a lot of the towns on the western frontier, they had the latest fashions because they were reading Harper's Weekly. See what those things are. But that is one of the fun things about doing a period film project is that it has to be all created. And the same with the future. You have to create the future. That leads to some interesting areas of exploration. Before we started Babylon 5, we actually sat down with a bunch of the folks at JPL and UCLA and USC to ask them about what they thought future trends were going to be. What's medicine going to look like? Because we had to build these sets in environments that would feel real. They needed to feel like they were an extension in the future of what we are familiar with today. And a lot of stuff, doesn't change a whole lot. I mean, back in the 1500s, a mug looked like a mug looked like a mug, and they still look like a mug today. I mean, we recognize what these objects are. So you take the familiar and tweak it a little bit, and then you've got room to do some other more outlandish things because of future trends may take us or something like that. But you have to create that entire world as well. It doesn't exist anywhere else except where on your soundstage.
So you sort of have the creditability of using a mug that everybody uses as a mug, and then you can extend other parts of it a little more fantastically. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, I think so. I think that a restaurant experience is going to be somewhat similar. I mean, we actually did, in Babylon 5, it was based on a Gerard O'Neill space station, which was spins like this to create gravity, but you've got a central corridor or a central area that is kind of a green belt, and we had restaurants in there, we had a baseball diamond, we had things that humans would want for recreation and leisure activity that kind of extrapolate into the future a bit. And one of the other aspects that we took with B5 is that in 300 years, 350 years, we're going to, when we step off and we are actually maybe have a colony on the moon or Mars or something, we're going to take our social problems with us. Just like when folks got on boats and came to the New World, they brought their social problems with them. They don't just get left on the shores of England as the boat leaves port. They come with you, and so that becomes an interesting thing to think about and incorporate into the storytelling and into the visual world that you're creating.
I really like the way this interview is flowing, so I'm going to threaten it by asking you a question that has a no. So, with that in mind, in Hollywood or outside of the fair, have you ever tried to replicate a fair workshop weekend where everybody sort of gets together and ties into the community gestalt of whatever the project you're working on is?
Hmm. You know, let me just cogitate on that for a second.
Okay.
I would say the closest for something like that was the documentary series that I did for Warner Brothers that was called The Wild West. It was about the settling of the West after the Civil War, up until the point that Congress declared the frontier closed in 1896. And we had 10 hours to do for that. And we were given way less time than Ken Burns had to do the 10 hours of the Civil War. He took 5 years, we got 11 months. And I had to sit down with the folks that were going to be working on segments, the producing teams and the research teams, and say, okay, here's the deal. I don't want to see any pictures. We have to think about this as a period piece. And so, therefore, any images that you use have to be older than 1896 because the West and stuff was still going on after the turn of the century. And in fact, in 1910, there were more wagons built that year than in any year previous to that. And the automobile was already on the roads then. I mean, that's a kind of a crazy fact to think about. But to tell them that what they needed to do was we had to be period with that, with the same with paintings. So an N.C. Wyeth painting of Wild Bill Hickok at a card table we couldn't use because that was from like 1918. The other thing we wanted the sounds to be, we wanted the music of the day. Folks back then didn't have radios or televisions or iPods, but music was really important. That was how the communities got together and played music. They had dances, and just about everybody played, some kind of an instrument. And so that kind of thing was really important for making feel of the show feel authentic and period. And so we had a great amount of research on the songs and musical things of the day. And the John McEwen of the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band was my music producer on that, and he produced the equivalent of probably 4 albums in like 6 months. We actually won an award for our soundtrack from the National Cowboy Hall of Fame and Western Heritage Museum in Norman,
Excellent.
Oklahoma, because it created that fabric of what these folks were doing in their leisure time at dances. And there are plenty of archival photos of folks sitting around a campfire or at a barn dance or something like that that we could use to visually punch that up. And that was kind of sitting down and talking to them about the criteria for how we were going to put this show together and what to include in the show was kind of like a fair workshop weekend. It's like learning how to be back in the time period.
I'm kind of running out of things to say.
Let me share one other thing with you that when I did start doing Babylon 5, because we had a lot of folks in prosthetic makeup, more so than Star Trek, where they tend to do eyebrows and noses. We did full head stuff. And one of the things that was a revelation to me when we started thinking about, casting and everything was people that have performed in masks. So in commedia are used to acting with their bodies, not just their faces. And that was an important thing. And so, Sandy Grimm, Billy Scudder, Jim's brother Drew, and Diana Dare, and then Mark Hendrickson. They all performed as aliens in various episodes of Babylon 5 because they could wear a mask and they could still give a performance through that with their whole body. And that also translated across for more human characters, the folks that have theater backgrounds and schooling in theater acting techniques. They can do a better performance with their entire body coupled with their face than just eyebrows and lips. And so that was something that I had learned from just watching, years and years of, stuff go on in the streets and on stages at the fair that informed a way to cast folks for various parts. Mary Kay Adams is a fairly well-known actress, does a lot of stuff on Broadway. And we cast her as the assistant for Jakar, who was the Narn ambassador on board the station. And it's a full prosthetic makeup, red contact lenses. And I get a call at 6 in the morning from the effects makeup guys going, Mary Kay's having a hard time with this. And I go, okay, I'll be, give me 15 minutes and I won't be there. I actually live close to where we were shooting. And I got down there, and what was a problem for her was she was seeing Mary Kay go away, and she was losing herself. And so, what, she's in the makeup chair, I'm sitting right next to her. Just hold my hand, it's going to be okay, you're going to be fine. I mean, she just about broke my hand, but it was really difficult for her to see everything that was familiar about her face was completely gone. And ultimately that was, she couldn't perform in that. And the years of stuff, I mean, like Jim, with all of the comedian, everything that he's done, there's no fear of having your face covered and being able to give a performance even though it's not your face anymore. There are a lot of actors that they have a very difficult time performing in prosthetics, and so that's tapping into performers that have a theater background, and actually any kind of mask work background becomes a part of a key to success for an episode, for the production, and also for them. There are plenty of folks that will audition for those things that won't get it. I mean, the folks that do, that you look at a resume and you see that, oh my God, they've done all of this, they've done commedia, they've done these kinds of theater things. They are somebody that we should consider if they can, discharge the part okay.
When you were kind enough to say yes to this interview, was there a story that you said, oh, I've got to be sure to mention fill in the blank? Is there a fill in the blank that we haven't gotten to yet?
Going back to this whole thing that Phyllis and Ron initially created, and then Phyllis continued to shape through the years. I think the fact that when we joined the fair as Once in Favor and doing the Reeves Tale, there were folks that had been doing a lot longer than us and all, but there was something about our little troupe and the performances that we gave on Drury Creek that at least once during the day you would see Phyllis at the back, and actually Will, and maybe Peg, probably Ernie or Dennis, watching our show. They enjoyed us and what we were doing, and I think appreciated that just as much as the Salami Delamore or any of the other groups that performed on Maybauer. And to me, that was, and to all the rest of us, I mean, our whole little group, I think that was our validation that we had actually done something. We had actually come up with something that worked, and we fit into the community for them. And
You
that
weren't
was
doing it just for the $8 in food tickets?
no. Well, we got some folding money too, but we also got food tickets. So, because one of the arguments that we made was, okay, you're not paying us hardly anything, so don't make us have to waste our money on buying food. And
A
that
cogent argument indeed.
yeah, and years later, up at Northern Fair, on a couple of occasions, because Jim and Marilyn and Stuart White were doing something on the Caravansary stage there, a commedia piece, and Phyllis, on two occasions, Phyllis kind of got up against me and says, "What do you think we could do a Once in Favor reunion? We would love to have you guys back at the fair." And to be asked that was like, oh my God, that's like so cool. And I said, let me throw that out to the winds and see how everybody reacts. But I said, we are all kind of doing such different stuff now. I don't know that we could devote the time to be at the level that we were back in the day. But I thought that was full that she asked.
Now that you, every time, say, I leave a party or an interview, I immediately think of the things I didn't say. I'd like to give you a moment now to think of the things you didn't say that you would like to say.
Well, I think one of the things that I want to acknowledge is that Jimmy Boris, David King, Craig Fleming, Marilyn Letchforth, Diana Dare, and myself. I think we came together and made something that was greater than ourselves. That we left a mark on the folks that came and saw us at the fair. And I always, memories of the fair are always, have always been pleasant. and all. And one of the things I'm always been grateful for is that got a chance to be on the stage there for a few years.
I think that's a fine place to end this episode of Fair Folk at Work. So then I'll stop recording now.
Okay.
Stop recording. That was my August 2023 interview with John Copeland. If you have questions or comments you'd like me to pass along to John, please feel free to email me at djng@earthlink.net. Questions or comments about the podcast itself can be directed to me at djng@earthlink.net. Finally, if you or someone you know would like to be a guest on Fair Folk at Work, you may also email me at djng@earthlink.net. But that's it for this time. Thanks for listening. See you next time. Bye bye.